Picture the worst thing you've ever left in the fridge and forgotten about. Maybe it's milk, maybe it's leftovers from a Friday night you'd rather not remember. And now imagine that instead of milk, it was, 200 tons of weaponized anthrax. And instead of a fridge, it was an entire secret island in the middle of the sea that then completely dried up, turning the island into a sort of peninsula, meaning anyone could just walk right up to it. Yeah, that happened. That is a real thing that happened. And somehow, that isn't even the most unhinged story that I'm telling you today. We are talking about abandoned laboratories. Not the sad kind, not some college chemistry room with a broken fume hood. The kind of lab that governments build in secret, ran for decades in secret, and then left in such a hurry that the coffee mugs are still sat on the desk. The kind that were disguised as children's summer camps and lumber mills. The kind where scientists clocked out on Friday, drove home, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist over the weekend, so they just sort of never went back. The kind where right now, literally today, if you know where to look, you can find the ruins of things that were never supposed to exist in the first place. So let's start with Manchuria, China, 1936. There's a sprawling compound outside the city of Harbin. Guard towers, laboratories, cremation facilities, 8 separate research divisions, a staff of thousands, and on the front gate, for anyone who happened to wander close enough to ask, a very reassuring sign that said, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Which sounds like an extremely boring local government office, and that was exactly the point. It was actually Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's biological and chemical weapons program, and arguably the most horrifying scientific operation in human history. The man running it was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who had become convinced after watching the international community ban biological weapons in 1925, well, that anything the world was that scared of had to be some jolly good shit worth pursuing. His logic was essentially, well, they banned it, which means it must be devastating, which means we need it. Which is a sentence that makes complete sense if you have no soul. Ishii recruited some of Japan's top scientists, real doctors, real researchers, people who had gone through medical school and taken oaths and stuff, and gave them an assignment that violated every one of those oaths, simultaneously. The compound at Harbin was the size of a small city, 1,000 buildings across 6 square kilometers, surrounded by a high voltage fence and a moat. And it was officially disguised as a lumber mill. A lumber mill. The cover story was so aggressively boring that it actually worked for years. Local people called the scientists inside the water purification people. They had no idea. They'd see smoke rising from the cremation chimneys and assume it was sawdust burning. Yeah, it wasn't sawdust. What was happening inside was the kind of thing that's almost impossible to read about, let alone talk about on camera. But it needs to be said, because it was real, and it happened, and the world mostly forgot about it. Prisoners, mostly Chinese, but also Russian, Korean, and some allied POWs, were referred to internally as Maruta, which is Japanese for logs. Not people, logs. They were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and diseases that Ishii's team were actively trying to combine into new hybrid illnesses. They conducted vivisections, surgeries on living people without anesthesia, specifically to study how disease progresses in real time through living tissue. Limbs were frozen and thawed repeatedly to study frostbite. The researchers weren't sadists by hobby, they were methodical. They were taking notes. They considered themselves scientists. When the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in August 1945 and the order came to shut down, Unit 731 had 3 days to disappear. They blew up the compound, released the remaining prisoners into the surrounding area, and then followed them to recapture and execute them, before anyone could talk. They burned every document they could find, and then General Ishii gathered his entire staff, gave them each a vial of potassium cyanide, and told them, if any of you were captured, use this. Do not let them know what we just did here. Then he put on civilian clothes and vanished into the countryside. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. American intelligence found him. They knew exactly what he'd done. I mean, they had enough evidence to prosecute him and everyone who worked for him under the same laws that they just used at Nuremberg. But they made a different choice. The United States government gave Shiro Ishii and his entire 731 research team complete immunity from war crimes, prosecution, everything, in exchange for the data. The research data from experiments conducted on human beings without their consent was simply absorbed into American military research programs. Ishii? Well, he lived on to a ripe old age and he died in Tokyo in 1959 from throat cancer in his own home. Yeah, none of them ever faced trial. The ruins of Unit 731 are still there. Harbin built a museum on the site in 1982. You can walk through the foundations of the buildings where the experiments happened. There are placards. There's a gift shop. Standing in it is one of those experiences that makes the concept of time feel genuinely strange. Like the floor that you're standing on is trying to tell you something and nobody's been listening long enough to hear it. But anyway, now from a secret compound in Manchuria, let's move to something that sounds like it came straight out of a Christopher Nolan fever dream. It's 1959. The Cold War is at its most paranoid, most expensive, and most architecturally creative peak. The United States takes one look at Greenland, a massive Arctic island covered in ice 800 miles from the North Pole, and thinks, perfect. We'll build a city under there. Not metaphorically, literally, a city. Underground, under the ice, powered by a nuclear reactor with tunnels, barracks, a library, a chapel, movie theatre, a hobby shop. Up to 200 soldiers living full-time beneath the Greenland glacier, commuting through ice corridors to their posts, eating in a cafeteria, watching films on Saturday nights in a room carved out of a glacier. They called it Camp Century, and the public relation campaign around it was somewhat extraordinary. Journalists came. National Geographic ran a spread. Boy Scouts from Kansas and Denmark actually won a contest to visit the place. The army presented it as proof that science could tame even the Arctic. What they didn't mention to journalists, or the Boy Scouts, or the Danish government whose territory this was happening on, was that Camp Century was a cover story. The actual project, classified so deeply that even most of the soldiers living there didn't know about it, was called Project Iceworm. And Project Iceworm's goal was to thread 2,500 miles of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet and hide 600 nuclear missiles inside them. 600! Each one pointed at the Soviet Union. The missiles would be constantly moving between 2,100 different silos on a rail system running through the ice, so that the Soviets could never pinpoint exactly where they were. It was the most elaborate shell game in military history, and it was powered by a nuclear reactor, and it was underneath a glacier, and it had a hobby shop. The problem, and there's always a problem, isn't there, with these things, which is honestly the most comforting fact about ambitious government projects, was the glacier itself. Ice, as it turns out, not that stable of a construction material. It sort of moves and melts and flows outward from its center, like constantly and slowly unstoppably moving. So the tunnels started narrowing almost immediately. By mid-1962, the ceiling of the reactor room had dropped so much that engineers had to physically lift it 5 feet. The rail tracks designed for the nuclear missile systems kept buckling under the pressure of the shifting ice. The missiles would have tipped over, and so the whole thing was quietly cancelled in '63. The nuclear reactor was yanked out in '64, and by '67, Camp Century was just completely abandoned. And then they did something extraordinary. They just left everything. The tunnels, the building, the equipment, the furniture, the 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, 24 million litres of sewage, the radioactive coolant from the reactor. The US military's assumption was that perceptual snowfall would bury Camp Century forever, encasing everything in ice for eternity, and so no one would ever have to deal with any of it. I mean, I guess that was a reasonable assumption for the climate of 1967. Problem there is it's no longer 1967, and in 2016, scientists released a study showing that due to climate change, the ice covering Camp Century would start melting by 2090, potentially releasing everything that was left down there. The fuel, the sewage, and the radioactive waste into the surrounding ocean. And then last year, in 2024, NASA was flying a radar-equipped jet over Greenland to measure ice thicknesses for climate research, and the instrument picked up something unexpected about 100 feet beneath the ice. Structures, buildings, basically the ghost of Camp Century. And it was perfectly preserved. And it's just been rediscovered by NASA scientists who described it by saying, and I love this one, "We were looking for the bed of ice and out pops Camp Century. We didn't know what it was at first." A Cold War nuclear city under a glacier, abandoned for 60 years, quietly waiting under the ice, and NASA found it again by accident with a climate radar. And the waste is still there. That's not a movie, that's Tuesday in the 21st century. But if you want the most cinematically absurd abandoned lab of all time, the one where the scientists were completely normal people living completely normal lives right up until the exact moment everything collapsed, you need to go to a stretch of water called the Aral Sea. Or more accurately, where the Aral Sea used to be. In the mid-20th century, the Aral Sea was the 4th largest lake on Earth. Crystal clear, fishing villages around the edges, boats, a place where, depending on which shore you were standing on, you were either in what's now Kazakhstan or what's now Uzbekistan. One of the islands in the middle of the lake was called Vozrodeniya, which translates as Rebirth Island, and in 1948 Stalin decided it was the ideal location to build a Soviet Union top-secret biological weapons testing facility. The island's extreme remoteness was the point. If anything escaped the lab, the water surrounding it would stop it from reaching the mainland. They evacuated the fishermen, shut down the small fish processing plant that had been the island's only industry, and then they built not just a laboratory, but an entire self-contained town called Aral Sea. 15 three-story apartment buildings, a stadium, school, shops, a social club, a power station, a 4-runway airfield designed like a compass rose, the only one of its kind in the Soviet Union, because the winds on the island were so unpredictable they needed a runway pointing in every direction. At its peak, 1,500 people lived there, scientists and their families, people who went to work in the morning and came home and cooked dinner and helped their kids with homework. One of the scientists who worked there, a man named Gennady Lepyoshkin, was interviewed decades later and described it with what might be the most unsettling sentence ever uttered in human history about a bioweapon facility. He said it was a beautiful place. The water came right up to the town and we used to swim and sunbathe after work. What he and his colleagues were doing at work every day was testing anthrax, bubonic plague, smallpox, tularemia, brucellosis, and some other things I can't pronounce on animals. Thousands of horses, sheep, monkeys, guinea pigs, hamsters. The test fields there in the southern part of the island were far enough from the town that the scientists could separate their professional and personal lives in the most extreme way imaginable. There were poles in the test field spaced out 1 kilometer apart, each one fitted with detectors. They would detonate shells containing weaponized pathogens or spray them from aircraft and then measure how far the cloud spread and how deadly it remained at each point. Between the experiments, they would document everything, then go home for dinner. In 1971, a Soviet research vessel passing near the island got caught in a cloud. Witnesses described it as a brownish haze drifting across the water. Anywho, several days later, one of the scientists aboard was diagnosed with smallpox. The outbreak spread to 10 people in our hometown. 3 of them died. The Soviet government never officially acknowledged that this even happened. When news of any kind leaked out, the official explanation was always something mundane. Contaminated meat, a coincidental infection. Nothing to worry about, comrade. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the whole thing stopped being anyone's problem. The order to evacuate Aral Sea came, and within weeks, not months, weeks, 1,500 scientists, soldiers and their families packed whatever they could carry and left. The labs were not cleaned, The equipment was never secured. The pathogens that had been buried in stainless steel containers in 1988, when the Soviet Union panicked before a surprise international inspection, and then hastily dumped 200 tons of weaponized anthrax into the ground, were simply left in the ground. Nobody locked anything, nobody filed a report, they just left. Scavengers naturally arrived almost immediately. Local people from the newly independent nations of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan sailing over to strip anything of value. Metal, furniture, equipment, all of it got hauled back across the water and sold off, with no idea what had been stored inside it, no idea what they were touching. Scientists who monitored the situation warned that weapons-grade plague bacteria could have survived in the soil and was possibly being passed from rat to rat in the ruins. Still spreading, still evolving. And then came the twist that makes this story genuinely science fiction. The Aral Sea was dying. The Soviet Union had been diverting the rivers that fed it for decades to irrigate cotton fields, and the lake had been slowly shrinking since 1960. The island had been growing as the water retreated. By 2009, the water was gone entirely. Возрождение Island, chosen specifically because it was surrounded by water, isolated, unreachable, was now a peninsula. You could just drive there. And locals did. Tourists do. Some of them take photos standing in the ruins of the town that used to have a stadium and a social club, not entirely sure what they're standing in the middle of. In 2002, the United States sent a team of 113 people with a $5 million budget to attempt a decontamination. They collected and neutralized somewhere between 100 and 200 tons of anthrax. Tests in 2005 revealed there was still contamination in the soil. By 2021, the Uzbek government had demolished what remained of the town. Today, all that's physically left is the geometric shape of the old airfield, visible from satellite, carved into the desert where a sea used to be, and whatever is still in the ground. 3 labs, all gone, all left behind. The first one was erased on purpose, burned, blown up, covered up, and the men responsible walked free. The second one was buried under ice and forgotten, and a NASA jet accidentally rediscovered it last year while looking for something else entirely. The third one just became a desert, and now anyone can go and stand in the ruins of bioweapon testing grounds if they drive far enough into the middle of nowhere in Uzbekistan. Here's what all 3 of them have in common. In every case, the people running them thought they had a way out, that they could shut it down, walk away, and eventually the evidence would disappear. Unit 731 blew it up and relied on secrecy. Camp Century counted on ice. Anthrax Island counted on water. And in every case, the thing they were counting on failed them. The ice melted, the sea dried up, and the secrecy, well, I mean, you're watching a video about it right now, so tell me how that worked out. And subscribe, because we're just getting started. These were the easy ones.